In today's episode, we're going to step back in time to explore the controversy that erupted when a famous rabbi made a controversial statement about Dovid Hamelech and the role of Tehilim in Jewish life. We will dive into the heated discourse and the fault lines it revealed within the Jewish community. We will gain insight into the differing views on the function and place of Torah study versus other forms of Jewish worship, and the divergent attitudes that Jews had at the time about the image of the tzaddik in Jewish life. There was a Chabad Chassid by the name of Reb Tuvia Belkin. He passed away in the 1940s in Eretz Yisrael. He was a Chabad Chassid. He wasn't necessarily a Lubavitcher Chassid, because there was another line of a Chabad Chassidim from one of the other children of the Tzemach Tzedek, the Kapos line, and he was a Chassid of that line of Rebbes. And he came here to America, I don't know, in the 1920s and 1930s, and he was here, and he had a significant influence on Chabad Chassidim, including Lubavitcher Chassidim that were here, and he was a very big Baal Shemua. In other words, he heard a lot of stories from erupted Chassidim, Chabad Chassidim in Russia, most notably the Mordechai Yoel Duchman, and he used to repeat these very often. And at a certain point, he committed many of his stories to writing. And he actually sent a notebook of many of his maises to the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the Frierdiker Rebbe should have this, and there's a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe acknowledging receipt of this manuscript of stories. This manuscript of stories to this day has never been published. What happened was, some of the stories were, not all, but some of them were kind of reformatted and presented in the Sefer from Falakan Shmuas V'Sipurim, not in his original volume, but in volume 2. Today it's a 3-volume set. So in volume 2, they have many of his stories are presented over there, but not all of them. Anyway, I have a friend by the name of Rabbi Shmuel Super, colleague at JLI, who last year, when the library put many of the manuscripts for the first time online, he was going through, and he came across this Ksav Yad, this manuscript in the library, that his Tuvia Belkin's handwriting, his autograph copy of his stories that he sent, that he wrote. Anyway, Rabbi Super decided that it would be a good idea to have this published, given that it's the original source of many of the stories that we know. And in fact, some of them are unknown, and some of them have important details that are missing. And so he's working on this manuscript, and he'll be publishing this in the next few months. Anyway, he was kind enough to share with me this particular story, along with the footnotes that he is going to be producing in this volume that has many of the sources that we're going to be discussing tonight, came about by him pointing me to them. Anyway, so that's a general introduction to a story that is presented in this manuscript by Reb Tuvia Belkin. We know the story from elsewhere. As I said before, it's in the Shmuas V'Sipurim. Also, Rabbi Zevin in Eretz Yisrael put out a volume of stories called Sipurei Chassidim. And he heard stories from Rabbi Belkin, and so he included the story that we're saying now exists in 2 places. It exists in Sipurei Chassidim by Rabbi Zevin. It exists in Falakan's Shmuas V'Sipurim. And but I'm going to be summarizing it as it appears in the Ksav Yad, in the manuscript from Reb Tuvia Belkin. So he says the following story. There was a Rebbe in Russia whose name was Reb Moshe of Savaran. Savaran is a city today in Ukraine, and this Rebbe was a Rebbe in this city. His dates are 1775 to 1838, roughly the time of the Mittel Rebbe. Is this Reb Moshe of Savaran. Anyway, he had a son-in-law who lives in Berdichev, also in Ukraine. And so Reb Moshe of Savaran, who, by the way, he was a Talmud of Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, amongst others. So he goes to visit one day his son-in-law in Berdichev. He comes to his house, and then at that time, there was a new development that happened in Berdichev. The story roughly happened, if we had to guess, we'd assume the story happened sometime in the 1830s. What happened in Berdichev? There was a group of carriers, porters. Their job was they would be in the marketplace, and if you needed to hire someone to carry from point A to point B, whatever it is, so you would hire them. So they got together, the Jewish ones, and they made a chevra Tehilim. This was a common thing. We're going to gather, I don't know if it was once a day or once a week, and we're going to say Tehilim together. And it says actually in the story that they're going to gather every Shabbos before dawn in shul, and they are going to say Tehilim with a minyan. Now, what happened was they decided that amongst the porters, they're all obviously very, very simple people, and they didn't have a lot of knowledge in Torah. They want to have in their group one or two knowledgeable people. So they asked a certain young man, a Ben Torah, that he should join their group. And this Ben Torah agreed to join their group. Anyway, they send this young man, this Ben Torah, they send him, they say, in Berdichev now, Reb Moshe Savaran, who's a very special Rebbe, has come to town. You know what? We're sending you as a shlichus to go and meet him. Why? Because they gathered together 25 ruble, and they said, we're going to give this to him as a pan, as a pidyon. Bring to him our charter. In other words, these types of societies, they would put together a charter, had rules. Maybe there was dues, and you had to pay. You had to show up a certain amount of time, and if you didn't show up a few weeks in a row, then you would get thrown out of the group. There was just like a chevra shas. You had chevra shas, and you had many other groups like this. So they had a charter. So they wanted that this holy Rebbe, Reb Moshe Savaran, who came visiting in Berdichev, should review this manifesto. And if he likes it, then he should sign his name on it, and it's endorsed by this great Rebbe, Reb Moshe Savaran. Okay. So this young man, the Ben Torah, comes along, and he comes to the house of the son-in-law of Reb Moshe. While he's there, there's another young man who's there. And this other young man says to him, I know you. You're a Ben Torah. Why are you part of a group of people who say Tehilim every Shabbos morning before dawn? You should be studying Talmud during that time. Why are you involved with Hanoshim Pshutim and their Tehilim? So the Ben Torah Shliach answered back, I don't understand. Just because you're able to learn, it means you're pater from reciting Tehilim? And then, this is the important line for today's shir, this Ben Torah young man said, in fact, don't you know about the Maimer Chazal where Dovid Hamelech davened that people who recite Tehilim should receive the same schar as those people who learn the topics of Negoim and Ahalos, which are the most difficult topics in Torah. In other words, why are you putting down Tehilim and saying that I shouldn't be part of them? There's nothing to be ashamed of in terms of saying Tehilim, because it's no less than studying the deepest sugyas in Talmud. Now the story has a continuation, but let's pause here and actually look at what medrash this young man was referring to. So the medrash is in the medrash Tehilim on Kapitel Aleph, and it tells on the pasuk Yiu l'rasen im refi v'hagen libi lefanecha. That Dovid Hamelech is speaking here, and he's saying im refi, the words that I speak, and hagen libi, the machshava in my heart. So it should be l'ratzain by Hashem, and it should be accepted lefanecha by Hashem. So b'pashtus we say, what does the pasuk mean? That what he meant, what David needed in that given moment, whatever he was talking about, he meant, God, listen to my prayer. The Medrash says there was something much deeper going on over here. That Dovid Hamelech was saying, Imrei fi, all of my Tehilim, v'hegyon libi, all of my Tehilim should be l'ratzin, God should accept it. What does that mean? God should accept it. So the Medrash explains, sheyasu l'doires, v'yuchaku l'doires. This should become for all generations to come, and it should be locked in. It should be codified for all future generations. So before we continue, in other words, what's Dovid Hamelech saying here? Tehilim could have been the prayers that one special man said in one special time. Just like, Avram said special prayers, we're sure. Yitzchak said special prayers. Yaakov said special prayers. Do we have those today? No, we don't have those today. So theoretically, you could add the same thing with Dovid Hamelech, that his tefillos would have been very, very special, but they wouldn't have become eternal. They wouldn't have become l'doros. Al derech zeh, if you think about it from the angle of the Beis Hamikdash, that many of the Kapitla Tehilim we're told, are related to the service in the Beis HaMikdash and were sung in the Beis HaMikdash. So what's going to happen after the Churban Beis HaMikdash? So easily these things could get lost. So Dovid Hamelech is turning to Hashem and asking that Tehilim should stick around. Or to use other language, it should become part of the Tanakh. And so just like the books of Bereshis through Divrei Hayamim, or all the books of the Tanakh are here forever, so too Tehilim should be here forever. Okay, but let's continue in the Lashon and the Medrash and see how the request that Dovid Hamelech says is given more words. Va'al yehu koirin bahem ke koirin b'sifrei meiras. People who read Tehilim, it shouldn't be counted as though they're just reading Sifrei Meiras. Sifrei Meiras is a word that Chazal use in the Mishnah and in the Gemara to refer to secular books, non-holy books. Usually it means books that it's permitted to read it, it's fine, it could be there's good wisdom there, but it's not holy, it's not sacred. So Dovid Hamelech is saying, I want to make sure that this is going to be Kedusha, that it's going to be Kedusha no less than any other book in Tanakh. Jews should read it and should be thinking about it. And here's the key line. And may Jews derive schar. Very often, how do we know about the relative value about something in Yiddishkeit? Is by its schar. Jews should be able to get schar for reciting Tehilim, Negoim ve'alos, like the Masechta of Negoim and Masechta of Alos. Negoim is the dinim of Tzaras. The dinim of Tzaras is Negoim. Very complicated subject. Alois is tumah. You go into a tent, that dead body, is the tumah conveyed? When? How? Also very difficult. In numerous places, Chazal use these two mesechtas when they want to bring out, like it's the most difficult type of thing. They use this as the symbol of the most difficult type of sugya. So in other words, what Dovid Hamelech is saying, not only Tehilim should be counted as an integral part of Torah, in fact, it should be like the most difficult part of Torah. And so, and a Yid should get the schar of reciting Tehilim, the same type of schar that one gets from learning the deepest aspects of Torah. So this is the Maimer Chazal that the Avrech, the Ben Torah, is saying to the person who accused him and asked him, why are you part of the Chevra of Tehilim? So let's go back now to the story and continue seeing what happens. So this, the critiquer, the man who critiqued him, is described here as being a little enlightened. And he says, I have an answer for you. You brought me a medrash. I'm not convinced by this medrash. Why is that? He says, because number one, the whole medrash is only saying that Dovid Hamelech asked that Tehilim should be like Negoim ve'alos. Like is not the exact same thing. This comes up a lot in Chazal when there's an equation between two things, and then you say, oh yeah, they're equated, but hold on. One is primary and the other one is only like it. So first of all, you should be learning Gemara. Why? Because Tehilim, maybe it's close, but it's not the same thing. That's number one. And number two, he said, by the way, the Medrash only says that Dovid Hamelech asked. Says he asked. It's the language of Dovid Hamelech. Who says that Dovid Hamelech actually had this request fulfilled? In the language, the way Reb Tuvia wrote the story, who says that this was effective? And then he added something interesting. He said, to the contrary, I saw in a sefer of a goyin echad, a certain goyin. And he says clearly that Dovid Hamelech's request was not effective, was not fulfilled. And so therefore, you're back to square one. Tehilim does not equal Negoim and Alos, and so therefore you shouldn't be doing this. Okay. So this conversation, let's remember, is happening between two young men. One a Ben Torah who joined the Tehilim club, the other, the more enlightened person who's critiquing it. But it's happening in the house of the son-in-law of Reb Moshe Savaran. Reb Moshe Savaran is a Chassidish Rebbe. He overhears this entire conversation. What happens? The story continues and it says, he turns to his son-in-law and he said, B'Israkshos Gedola, did you hear this? Dovid Hamelech made a request. He didn't accomplish anything. This is what the guy said, Oy li. And then he repeated this again and again. And he said, Oy vei izmir. Dovid Hamelech asked, and he wasn't answered. Oy vei izmir. Es hat doch mir angeheben schneiden in boich. Translate this in our English. I'm sick to my stomach from hearing this. I'm sick to my stomach from hearing this idea that Dovid Hamelech made a request and wasn't answered. He didn't critique the first point. The first point that it's not mamish the same thing, it's only close. He didn't critique that. But the Rebbe critiqued the idea that Dovid Hamelech put in a request and that it wasn't answered, he's very, very upset by that. Now the story has a continuation. We'll come back to it, but here we want to pause. We want to ask a simple question. It says that there's a sefer that said this. So can we identify which is the sefer? Who is the sefer? Who is the author that wrote this idea that Dovid Hamelech asked, but the request wasn't granted? So we turn now to the author of the Torah Tmima. Torah Tmima is the Chumash, very famous Chumash, that was put out by Baruch Halevi Epstein. The Baruch Halevi Epstein was a son of the Aruch HaShulchan, the Rabbi Yechiel Michal Halevi Epstein. The Torah Tmima, Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, was also a nephew of the Netziv. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhiner Yeshiva. Now, he's most famous for putting out the Torah Tmima, which is Chumash. And it has his collection of Ma'amarei Chazal under it, and under that a running commentary. He also wrote a long, I don't know exactly how to identify it, I guess you would say it's an autobiography of sorts. Stream of consciousness, thoughts about his memories, childhood, a lot of Chidushei Torah, and a lot of ideas in this book that he printed in 1928. He passed away in around 1940, 42, something like that. In 1928, he printed this volume called, 4 volumes, called Makar Baruch. So in Makar Baruch, he actually says something that's going to help us out, possibly. What does he say? He says that my uncle, the Netziv, couldn't stand it in Volozhin if a bacher would take too much time for davening and take away time from learning. Remember, this is not Lubavitch, this is in Volozhin. And the Netziv, my uncle, used to say, a Maisa. What was the Maisa? The Maisa was, and in the days of Reb Chaim of Volozhin. Reb Chaim of Volozhin is the one who founded this yeshiva in Volozhin. His dates are roughly the times of the Alter Rebbe, 1749 to 1821. When Reb Chaim of Volozhin would see a bacher in yeshiva who is taking away time from learning to say Tehilim, this would bother Reb Chaim very much. So he once saw a bacher doing this, and he told him, this is not okay. He reprimanded him. So the guy said, what are you talking about? It says in the Medrash that Dovid Hamelech asked that whoever whoever gets involved in the recital of Tehilim, it's going to count like you're learning the Goyim and Alois. So Reb Chaim Volozhiner thought for a minute, and he said, true, he asked, but we don't know what he answered. Meaning, we don't know what Hashem answered. In other words, Reb Chaim Volozhiner, according to this source, is Taka giving the argument in the story. It's not a sefer yet, but we're seeing a source here that maybe it was Reb Chaim Volozhiner. There's only one problem. The problem is that, as has been documented extensively, and it's not our business to get involved in this tonight, the Makar Baruch is a very unreliable sefer. He says a lot of things in there that have been debunked. A lot of people have written about this in the last 30 or so years, maybe more. And so, just looking at this source and to run away with that and to say that it was Chaim Volozhiner, most people would be uncomfortable doing it just based off the Makar Baruch. But the good news is that Reb Chaim Volozhiner wrote a sefer. He wrote a sefer called Nefesh HaChaim. We've discussed, when we spoke about the Tzimtzum, we looked at the Nefesh HaChaim a few weeks ago. Anyway, the Nefesh HaChaim has taka a passage on this medrash. And so therefore we're going to be able to look and see what he himself said about this directly. However, in order to understand what he's writing in Nefesh HaChaim, we first need to do a little bit of an introduction about the topic of Torah Lishma. What does it mean, Torah Lishma? Lishma means for the purpose of it. Torah for the purpose of it, for the right purpose, rather than the wrong purposes. What does it mean? What are we saying? What is it and what is it not? What is Torah Lishma? So if you look in the Rishonim, there's actually different things that are said about Torah Lishma. So I'm going to present now 3 different shittis about what Torah Lishma is. Of course, they could all be true, but 3 different definitions of what does it mean to learn Torah Lishma. Rashi in Brachas Daf Yuzayin Amud Aleph, when he's talking about Torah Lishma, says, when he's talking about Torah Shaloi Lishma, he says it's talking about someone she'ein loimid kedei l'kayim. The person is not learning in order to actually follow what it says. In other words, I'm not going to allow this to influence my life. I'm not allowing it to influence my behavior. I'm learning because I'm learning, but not in a way that it's going to be influencing my b'poil. Shaloi Lishma, he says, is lekanter. Lekanter is I'm only learning so that I could criticize and hurt my friend, because I could slug him up, for example. That's called learning lekanter. So the Gemara in Bracha says that a person who learns shaloi lishma lekanter, noyach lo shaloi nivra, better they, very harsh language, better they should not be created. Along the way, Rashi tells us, so what is lishma? Lishma is when you're learning kadei lekayim. And indeed, there are many sources that when they talk about lishma, lishma means I'm learning the Torah in order to allow it to influence my life. That's definition number one. Definition number two comes from the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva writes as follows. Hilchos Tshuva Perek Yud writes as follows. Any person who involves himself in the learning of Torah, loy liyira, not because they're afraid of punishment, the loy lekabel schara, not to reap reward, elo b'pnei avas odoin kol haaretz shativa ba, but because of the love of God who commanded it, harei zeh oisek ba lishma. That's called learning lishma. Lishma is when you do it for the right reason, meaning not for reward, not for punishment, because God said so. That's called Torah lishma for the Rambam. Okay, that's another definition of lishma. Now let's look at the Rosh. The Rosh is in a Dorim, Daf Samach Beis, and he's stelling on words in the Gemara where it says v'daber bohen lishman. A person should talk about Torah, and they should do it in a way that it's lishma. Says the Rosh. What is lishma? Kol diburcha u'masa'acha b'divrei Torah. All of your involvement and speech in Torah, yil l'shem ha-Torah, should be for the purpose of the Torah. What does it mean for the purpose of the Torah? Kegoin leida ulahavin, to know, to understand, ulahoisef lakach, and to understand further, upilpul, and to be able to go even deeper. So what's lishma here mean? Lishma means I'm not learning this text so that I could then go away from this text and accomplish something somewhere else. I'm learning this text to get to know this text, which will enable me to learn another text, which will enable me to understand it deeper, which will enable me to understand it deeper, and to learn another text, etc., etc. So in other words, lishma, mamish, l'shem ha-Torah, for the purpose of studying the discipline itself. These are three different ways that the Rishonim talk about lishma. One is for Maisa, one is only for God, not for any ulterior motive, and the other is I'm learning Torah so that I be able to learn more Torah and gain mastery over the text and nothing else. These are three different ways that the Rishonim talk about lishma. Now what happens is that starting with the Mekubalim and then later in Chassidus, there is a different direction to lishma. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya writes in Perek Hey as follows: V'lishma, what does it mean to learn Torah lishma? Hainu kedei lekasher nafshay la'Hashem, to connect your neshama, your soul, to God. Al yedei hasagas haTorah, through comprehending the Torah. Because remember, the Alter Rebbe in the beginning of Perek Hey elaborates on the fact that Torah is God's wisdom, and His wisdom and Him are one. And so therefore, when a person comprehends an idea in Torah, so then they become unified with the Eibishter. Ish kefi sichloi, every person in accordance with their own understanding. He's saying, what's the source that this is the idea of lishma? This comes from the Chaim Vital, and the Sefer Priyetz Chaim writes this. What does it say in Priyetz Chaim? So it says as follows, in Shar Hanhogas Halimud, it says as follows: Iker kavonas hakriya b'Torah, the main intention you should have when you're studying, tolui bazeh, is contingent on the fact sheyechavein, you should have kavana lekasher es nafshay. Those are very similar words that the Alter Rebbe used. To tie, to bind your soul, lahadbika l'sharsha, connecting it to its source. It's a little different. You want to connect your neshama to its source. The source is Lamaila and Elam Isal Yainim, and the way you connect your neshama down here in the body to its source, Lamaila, which obviously is unified with God, so it's the same idea, happens through Torah. This is a different tone that we're seeing amongst the Rishonim, and there are many Svarim that talk about Lishma in this way. Now, I don't want to say and reduce that Chassidus says that Lishma is only this, because there are many sources in Chassidus, especially in Chassidus Chabad, that talk about Lishma, and we're not going to get into a full discussion of what does Chassidus Chabad say, the different levels of Torah Lishma. Suffice it to say that in Chassidus Chabad and in other Chassidus as well, there is a significant focus on this idea of Torah Lishma, that it's about connecting your neshama to Hashem. That is, Torah is the avenue through which you connect your soul to Hashem. Okay, with that background, we can understand the shtickle of the Nefesh HaChaim. Nefesh HaChaim, Shar Dalid, addresses the inyan of learning Torah. Okay, we're going to learn now from the Keta, from the first printing of the Nefesh HaChaim, which was in 1824, which is after Reb Chaim Volozhiner already passed away. He passed away 3 years earlier. It was printed by his son, Reb Yitzchak of the Lajin, who also took him over as a Rosh Yeshiva. Anyway, it says as follows. Let's read this piece, and we'll read it really carefully, because this is going to be really central to understanding our story. Inyan Eisek HaTorah Lishma. Let's talk about what is the topic of learning Torah Lishma. Ha'emes ha'borer. The absolute truth is, Ki Lishma ain't pirusha devekus. Lishma is not dvekus. Lishma is not for connectivity. It's not about linking yourself with God, which is what most people today are saying. You're able to see right away that there's a polemic going on here. There's Nefesh HaChaim sees something happening in front of his eyes. Maybe he would say he sees a change developing in front of his eyes, where Lishma meant one thing when he was growing up, and now the masses of Jews in Lithuania, where he's growing up, understand Lishma in a different way, in the Hasidic way. Dveikos, connecting with Hashem. So he says this is not the Lishma. He doesn't deny that it happens. He doesn't deny that a person connects to Hashem through learning Torah. He doesn't deny, but that's not what Lishma is. Remember, Lishma is the pinnacle, is the top, is the highest. That's the goal we're striving for. That's not Lishma, he says. Why? So he's going to bring a raya now. What's his raya? Shaharei Amru Razal b'Medrash, because Chazal told us in the Medrash, Shabikesh Dovid Hamelech alav hashalom milafanav yisparech, that Dovid Hamelech asked the Eibishter, Tehilim, that a person who's involved with Tehilim, it should be counted just as he is involved in Negoim and Ahalos. He quotes our Medrash. Okay, what's his comment? Hare, what do you see from here? You're able to see here that being involved in Shas, learning what we would call nigla, that's higher and more precious by Hashem than Tehilim. Why? Because very simple. The default is Negoim and Ahalos. You needed Dovid Hamelech came along and said, I know Tehilim is not Negoim and Ahalos, it's just Tehilim. And I know that, and you know that. But I'm asking you, Hashem, please do an unnatural thing. Create a miracle, so to speak. That even though it's not the same thing, make it as though it's the same thing. Similar to the first point that wise guy said before. It's only kamai. By very definition, the fact that there needs a special request means that on its own it's not. And I'm turning to you and asking you that you should make it that way. And so therefore, what does he establish from the Medrash? He establishes from the Medrash that there's a hierarchy. What's at the top of the hierarchy? Negoim and Ahalos. That's at the top of the hierarchy. Tehilim is a close second. It's a close second. That's the maximum it is. Okay, so what does it have to do with his point? Remember, his main point is to say, Torah Lishma is not Dveikus. So now he fears Isis' point. V'im noimar. Shalishma pirushay dveikus tafka. If you say that Lishma means connectivity with Hashem, v'rak bazet toli kol ikir inyanei sekatayra, and really all of Torah operates around the theme of dveikus, so then this medrash doesn't make sense anymore. Why? Because haloi ein dveikus yoiser nifla me'amiras tehilim karoi kol hayoim. There is no better way to achieve connectivity with Hashem when a person sits down and says Tehilim. That's dveikus with Hashem. And yet, we know that, as again, if you want to give numbers, Negoim and Ahalos is number 10, you're able to see here. Dovid Hamelech came along and said, Tehilim, please, 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 make it as if it's a 10, which by definition means it's only an 8. That gets you dveikus, you get complete dveikus in Tehilim. Is a raya that Torah Lishma is a whole different ballgame. You want dveikus, you go to Tehilim and you get that in the number 8. Torah Lishma is something else entirely. It's on a whole nother plane, as is evident from this medrash. And so therefore, don't talk to me about dveikus and Torah. It's also there, but you're missing the point if you limit Torah Lishma to dveikus. This is the raya that he brings. Now in this model, the talking point is that Tehilim is an 8, Torah is a 10, so dveikus you achieve in Tehilim is a raya that Torah must be more than dveikus. Now he goes on and look at the next line. Look what he says. The gam, by the way, maybe even we shouldn't give Tehilim an 8. Maybe even we shouldn't give Tehilim an 8. Why? Who says God agreed to David's request? Because if you look in that medrash, you will not see what God responded. In fact, it doesn't say anything. It just says David asked, and it doesn't have any response. So there's a 50% chance that God's answer was no. Right? You could ask, but maybe his answer was no. If his answer was no, then it brings up my point even more. Why? Because now Tehilim, instead of an 8, is only a 4. Yet Dveikus, again, it's top Dveikus. So now it shows you even more that Torah Lishma and Dveikus are very, very, very far apart from each other. Okay, but either way, he made his point. Because maximum, it's a number 8 because it's only Kemoi, it's only as if. In which case, Dveikus is a number 8, Tehilim is a number 8, Dveikus is a number 8, Torah Lishma has to far surpass it. But he even is willing to say that maybe even Dovid Hamelech's request wasn't answered, in which case Tehilim, which is Dveikus par excellence, is only a number 4. It doesn't even get close to Torah. It's a raya, Torah Lishma must be something else, not Dveikus. Now he brings another raya, by the way. If you're going to tell me Torah Lishma was only about Dveikus, then Vegam ki hoya dai le'inyan ha-Dveikus b'mesachas achas. You only want Dveikus? Learn Mesechus Sukkah all year, again and again and again, on a loop. Learn Mesechus Sukkah on a loop. In fact, why Mesechus Sukkah? Perek, learn the same Perek on a loop. Or Mishnah Echad, learn one line. It's the same Dveikus. Sheyasik bo kol yama b'Dveikus. You could achieve Dveikus that way. And then, how do you know you're not supposed to do that? So here it's interesting, because there's dinim that tell you you're not supposed to do that. You need to cover ground in Torah. It's clear halachas. But for whatever reason, he points to the Chazal where it tells us that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai learned everything, comprehensive learning, lo hiniach mikra, and mishnah, halachis, and agadas. So we see there's this idea of comprehensiveness. In Dveikus model, how does comprehensiveness make sense? There's no necessity for comprehensiveness. But in my model, it's actually going to make sense. Why? Because aval emes, you want to know what Torah Lishma is. Inyan Lishma, Pirish, L'Shem HaTorah. I'm learning Torah for Torah. V'inyan Kamasha Pirish HaRosh, like the Rosh said. I'm learning this Taisvus. So first of all, that I understand it really well. And then when I max out this one, that I could understand the next one. And I'm understanding the next one so that I can understand the next one. Oh, that model makes sense. That's why you need to have comprehensiveness. The idea is, I want to get to know all of you. Yeah? If I'm in love with Torah, I want to get to know every single aspect of you. That's called Torah Lishma for him. So what's happening here is, if you take a step back and you notice what's happening here, is actually a polemic here on 3 different levels with 3 different things that Chaim of Volozhin was not comfortable with. Number 1 is the way the conversation was going at the time about Torah. Why are we learning Torah? Because in the Hasidic community, there was an emphasis on the idea that Torah is for Dveikus and connecting with Hashem. Reb Chaim Volozhin didn't want that. Because Reb Chaim Volozhin wanted that Torah should be at the top, not for something else. Torah should be at the top. And by the way, there's nafkaminas between the two. Why? So for example, is it important that you should learn what he writes, and he discusses this after this kata a few chapters later he discusses it. Is it important to learn Sifrei Yira, Sifrei Musar, Sifrei Chassidus? So if you say the whole goal of learning is for Dveikos, so then you say, of course. Why? Because you're learning, you could learn for many, many months, and you're not thinking about the Eibishter, you're not feeling him. So therefore we say, oh, you need to learn Chassidus before and Sifrei Musar after, and you need to do all that, and then take breaks during your learning, and remember, and it says this in Sifrei Chassidus, take breaks and remind yourself that God's present within here. Because if your goal is Dveikus, then you got to make sure that happens, right? But he doesn't want that, because now it means you're learning a little less Torah. Whereas in his model, you don't need to do that. He says you don't need to do that. Torah Lishma, you're learning, you just need to get to know this thing, that's all. Once you have that, you have everything in it. He says you're not going to need to learn the Sifrei Yira so much, a little maybe. So in other words, he wants that Torah should be, don't say Torah for something else. Because the second you say Torah for something else, all of a sudden you open a conversation. And we could also do other things. There are other activities we can do for connectivity. And all of a sudden, you degrade the value of Torah study. And you also maybe take the schleppers in the community and you say, yeah, they also have ways of connecting with Hashem. That also degrades the Torah study. So this is one area that you see he's uncomfortable with. There's 2 other things that's going on over here. The other is Tehilim. What role should Tehilim have in a Jewish community for Leim Dei Torah? Obviously, Pashta Yidden should say Tehillim, there's no doubt about it, Reb Chaim Volozhin has supported that. But should Leimdim, should they recite Tehillim? So his view is no. He doesn't think they should recite Tehillim. Why? Because there's another thing that they could do. So again, number one is what's the definition of Lishma? What's the place of Torah versus other things? Number two is Tehillim per se. Is this for the Lamdim as well? Number three, if you think really well, you notice there's another thing going on over here. What's that? He's introducing a Moira de Kachap, a Moira de Inyan. Dovid Hamelech asked, who says he was answered? Remember what's going on at this day, and remember what some people are uncomfortable with. There's hundreds of thousands of Jews who have relationships with tzaddikim, with rebbes, who are going to them for advice, who are going to hear Torah with them, and we know this bothered some people. They felt this is why he knows more Torah than you, but you're going to say he's such a holy man, and you're bringing requests and asking him to daven for you. Dovid Hamelech asked, and he wasn't answered. Dovid Hamelech wasn't answered, and so it's not up to say that a tzaddik wants something and it's not going to happen. In other words, it diminishes the role of the tzaddik in the community when you have this type of thing. So there's a lot packed in this one keta of the Nefesh HaChaim. And it turns out that the account from Reb Baruch Halevi Epstein seems to be reliable. Seems to be a reliable account that the story taka happened with Reb Chaim of Volozhin. So now let's go back to our town in Berdichev, sometime in the 1830s. Where there's a Rebbe, a Moshe Savaron, who overhears this person saying that he saw it in a sefer. L'chayra, this person saw it in the sefer of the Nefesh HaChaim. And the Moshe Savaron overhears this, and as he said, oy vey, terrible to hear this idea that Dovid Hamelech's request wasn't answered. He says it makes him sick to his stomach. Now the truth is, it's not only that it made Moshe Savaron sick to his stomach. Many people, when they saw this passage in the Nefesh HaChaim, also felt the same way. So I'm going to show you in a minute how there was a big polemic that arose around this issue about, can you say Dovid Hamelech's request wasn't answered? But really, I want to just come back to the idea that there's three issues here. So Benegei Torah Lishma and the Hasidic way of understanding it versus the Litvische way of understanding it. I'm going to put that aside. We're not going to really get into it. We touched on it a little, but it's not so negir. I want to talk for 2 minutes on the question of Tehilim. Tehilim for the Lamdim or not, and then we'll go over to the third part, and that is Dovid Hamelech's request, is it automatically answered, so to speak, or not? So Benegei Tehilim as follows. I want to show you in a few sources from Litvische sources, where you see this idea that Tehilim is not for the Lamdim. So first up is Reb Nachman Ruvain Maryovich. He printed a sefer called Chalkas Ruvain in 1907. He's a Talmud of Rabbi Yitzchak of Volozhin. Okay. So he is dealing with this medrash, where it says, Tehilim should count as Negoim v'alos. So he's trying to explain, what does this mean? What Tehilim should count as Negoim v'alos? What's the Tehilim should count as Torah? Why is this necessary? Why is this important? So what does he say? He says very simple. He brings a host of sources that a person can't do tshuva without Torah. Okay? Let's not get too far into it, but he brings a whole bunch of sources. Tshuva, you need to have Torah in order to do tshuva. So I asked the Shaila, good, for the elites, that's great. What about the Pashta people? And Dovid Hamelech cares about tshuva. He's the paragon of tshuva. So he looks out and I see he's the Talmid Chacham, and they're going to use Torah to achieve tshuva. What's a simple Jew going to do? So he composed Tehilim and he turned to Hashem and said, let this be K'negoyim v'alos, just like Torah accomplishes tshuva for the elite, so Tehilim will accomplish tshuva for the non-elites, for the Pashta people. This is the piece that he says. Why am I bringing this? I'm bringing this because you're able to see it's so obvious to him. What's Tehilim for? Tehilim is for the Amaratzim. That's the whole conversation of Tehilim is for the Amaratzim. This is Reb Nachman Ruvain Maryovich writing in 1907, again, a Talmud of Rabbi Yitzchak of Volozhin. Here's another source. Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, the Rosh Yeshiva in Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary. In 1944, he wrote an essay called Ish HaHalacha. And in this essay, he writes as follows. He writes, there was a Maisa that his father is Reb Moshe Soloveitchik, who's a son of Chaim Brisker, which is very much related in many ways to the Volozhin dynasty. Anyway, so my father came into shul on the night of Rosh Hashanah, and he found me saying Tehilim Imat Tzibur. He took away, he doesn't say how old he was. He took away the Sefer Tehilim, and he gave me a Mesaches Rosh Hashanah. And he said, if you want to serve God now, Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote this in Hebrew. If you want to serve God now, you want to live with the times? Living with the times for you, a genius boy, means learning Maseches Rosh Hashanah, not reciting Tehilim. Okay, so here you see there's a second source bringing out this idea. There's also a book on the Griz, and that is Velvele Brisker, who's Reb Moshe's brother. Reb Moshe is the one who took away the Tehilim from his son. There's a sefer called Pnini HaGriz, Pnini Rabbeinu HaGriz. And in the sefer it says that the Griz said that later in life in Yerushalayim, when he was already an old man, he was saying Tehilim Rosh Hashanah. So another Litvisher Rav came over to him and said, Tehilim on Rosh Hashanah? Well, for you, the Griz? So he said, you're right. When I was young, I never said Tehilim on Rosh Hashanah. We only learned. However, I realized you learn, you always have to stop learning. Tehilim, if you want, you could say it the entire day, no interruptions when you're walking, when you're coming, or when you're going. This is the excuse, so to speak, that he gave of why he's saying Tehilim. But you see again that the idea was upgefrekt by the rabbi. He himself says that he wasn't doing it when he was young. You see this idea that is reflected in the Nefesh HaChaim that the Tehilim is not it doesn't reach the level. It's only whatever number you want to give it, but it doesn't reach the top. The MS is that this is not a debate that first arose in the 1800s about whether Tehilim is for the Lamdim or not, and what role Tehilim should have. I came across there's a piece from the Cairo Gniza where there's a tshuva from Rav Hai Goin. Rav Hai Goin is in the 1000s in Iraq. And look at the Shiloh over there. So this is a piece that's in Cambridge University Library. And it was published a few years ago. It says like this. The question is, V'sha'alta, you ask the question. Anashim shanagu b'chol yom Shabbos u'moed likrei Tehilim. There's people in a community that had the custom every single Shabbos and Yom Tov to read Tehilim. Ba'oid laila beis hachreses, while it was still night, meaning before dawn, just like these carriers, the porters in Berditchev. Ad she'egi zman hatfila, until Shachris. Uvami she'ilat zoysam la'azav min hagzeh. Someone came to town and says, you got to stop this custom of reciting Tehilim. Talmud, Mishnah, Halachas. Why are you doing Tehilim? Talmud, Mishnah, and Halachas. The people who are reading Tehilim, they're not even baki, they don't even know how to do this learning. So the question was, is it mutter for them to stop their custom of Tehilim and to transfer over into the new custom of learning? So you see already over here, there was also a tension between those who wanted to say Tehilim and someone said, no, this is not the right way ahead. Obviously, we would love to know the answer, but when you have a fragment, so this is all we were given. So we have the question asked of Hai Goin. We do not know what his answer was. Okay, all of that is about polemic number 2, and that is the role that Tehilim should have in a community, whether it's relevant for Lamdim or not. Number 3 is the bigger issue that we want to focus on, because that's what got the Rebbe upset. Reb Moshe got upset about that. And look at this text, back to Rabbi Mariovich in his 1907 volume. He writes, "V'shamaiti ki anshe ha'olam maranenim al zeh." He quotes a Nefesh HaChaim and he says, I hear people saying, scandal, scandal, scandal. Okay, so I know that he's printing this in 1907. It's not like in 1906 they started saying scandal, scandal, scandal. They started saying this right when the book was printed. They were saying scandal, scandal, scandal. Why? Kivin sha'amru ritzon yerei av yaseh. I'll tell you how I know in a second, but that it was earlier. Kivin sha'amru ritzon yerei av yaseh. It says in the pasuk, Hashem does what the people of Yiras Hashem want. In came bevada, he's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How could you say that Hashem didn't listen? Okay, now how do we know that already in the 1830s there was already a scandal about this line? We know. So first of all, the Maisa with Reb Moshe presumably happened during that time, but we know of another reason. The Nefesh HaChaim was printed the first time, what did I say, 1824. The second time Nefesh HaChaim was printed was in 1837, Tov Kuf Tzaddik Zayin. Again, it's not printed by Reb Chaim Volozhiner himself, the first print wasn't. In here, there was an addition, in the second printing there was an addition made. What was the addition? So let's read. Who knows if God agreed? We don't find an answer. Parenthesis. Where it says, where it says those words, which we'll read in a moment. Wow. So in the second print, someone added in parentheses a source for the contention that's being made here that maybe Dovid Hamelech wasn't listened to, here's a Maramakah. It was printed by Rabbi Yitzchak of Volozhin, so the assumption is that he's the one who put it in. Why did he put it in? Why would he have added a source to claim that he didn't do this up and down through the Nefesh HaChaim? He did it here, presumably, because people had tightness about what it said here. So here you're able to see that the Merananim Alzeh from 1907 is a Merananim that's been going on for 60, 70 years beforehand. So what is the Gemara that Rabbi Yitzchak brought to justify his father's claim that God didn't listen? So the Gemara in Baba Basar Daf Yuzayin says as follows. Shiva lo shalat bohem rima v'taleo. There are 7 people who, after they passed away, the body didn't start decomposing with worms and other means. The Eluain, here are the people: Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, Miriam, and Binyamin. Okay, that's 7. Yeshoimrim, and then we have a Machlokes, and the second view says, Af Dovid Hamelech as well. Why? Because it says in Tehilim, Af Psari Yishkan Levatach. May my flesh dwell securely. So in other words, what does it mean, may my flesh dwell securely? This view is interpreting it is that even after I pass away, let it be at peace without anything bothering it. So therefore, I'm going to include Dovid Hamelech as number 8, that also no Rima and Tailea got into his body after death. Okay, so now we have a Shaila. What about the Tanakama? What about the first opinion? Why didn't he include Dovid Hamelech? Why did he say only 7? And for the Gemara, the Idach, no, I'm not counting David. Why am I not counting David? Because he asked. What does this mean? What's Rabbi Yitzchak of Volozhin telling us? What does that mean? He asked. It wasn't granted. He asked. Good. So those 7, it was granted. He asked, and it wasn't granted. Oh, so Rabbi Yitzchak of Volozhin is saying, why are you guys getting all nervous? That my father said that Dovid Hamelech's request that Tehilim be counted as an Goyim and Alois, maybe it wasn't answered. Here you see, Taka, not everything for Dovid Hamelech was answered. You see over here, his request about what happens to his body after Me'av Esrim didn't happen. According to one opinion, didn't happen. According to one opinion, it did, but at least according to one opinion, it didn't. Okay. Now, let me bring you back to the story. Because now we have a defense. So this guy who said he saw in the Sefer, this intelligent guy who said he saw in the Sefer, and he saw that number 1 is only Kamoi, and number 2, Lav Dafki was answered, went on to say a Raya. In other words, he saw the second printing of the Nefesh HaChaim, because he's bringing the Raya that's mamish from Baba Basra Yuzayin that has this, and that's how we know this story. You're able to date the story to the 1830s, the printing of the second Nefesh HaChaim. So the continuation of the story is that he said, there's a Gemara Mefureshes and Baba Basra Daf Yuzayin Omer Aleph where it says that Dovid Hamelech asked and it didn't work. And the Savaraner hears this. The Savaraner, remember he said he's sick to his stomach. So the Savaraner says as follows. Look at number 18. They're so blinded by their eyes as they can in Garnid Zen can emes pshat in the Gemara that they can't see the true pshat in the Gemara. So now the Savaraner is going to tell us how to read this Gemara, because it looks like a very good raya that Dovid Hamelech's request wasn't answered. So he goes like this. The Gemara asks, why doesn't the Tanakama count David as one of the people? Because it says he asked, it must be it happened. So if it must be it happened, so why is he not counted? So the Gemara answered, David, I'm not counting him. I agree that his body didn't decompose, but I'm not counting him because he asked for it. He had to ask. We're only counting those who didn't ask. So in other words, these 7 are special. They didn't ask, it still happened. David, he asked for it and it happened. So therefore, I'm not going to count it. And so therefore, he views this as a scandal that you would interpret a Gemara, it seems, to interpret a Gemara to say that Dovid Hamelech asked something and it didn't happen. A scandal, he says. Okay. Now the emes is that even if you're able to interpret this Gemara the way that Moshe did, there are other Gemaras. In other words, you're eventually going to hit a roadblock, because there are Gemaras where it says that Dovid Hamelech asked for something and he didn't get it. And in fact, this Reb Nachman Maryovich, when he talks about this scandal, he brings a different raya, not the Nefesh HaChaim's raya, because there's an interpretation around it. He brings a different raya. He brings a raya from Sanhedrin Daf Kuf Zayin Amid Aleph. What does it say in Sanhedrin Kuf Zayin Amid Aleph? It says as follows. V'nikesi mipash Arov, Dovid Hamelech asked of Hashem to be cleansed of his sins. And what does the Gemara interpret this to mean? Shlo yikasev sirchuni. I don't want my sin to be written into the Sefer Shmuel. It shouldn't say it. Amar loi, Hashem said, Yafshar, impossible. And we know Taka that it's written in Sefer Shmuel. So here you see that the request from Dovid Hamelech wasn't granted. So what's Reb Moshe going to do? So there, in that Gemara, he was able to interpret it in a way that his request was granted. What's he going to do over here? So you see over here that in fact it is true. It's not upgefrek to say that something Dovid Hamelech asked for wasn't granted. There's another ayah. In fact, there's many of the many different svarim, mechabrim svarim, got involved in this issue and go through Shas trying to find different rayas about Dovid Hamelech. We're only going to do one more because I don't want to. You can do this forever. And anyway, it's not so negea as I'm going to show you in a second. But right now, let's look at another Gemara where you're going to see pretty clear that Dovid Hamelech asked for something and it wasn't granted. There's a very difficult story in Sefer Shmuel about the Givonim. Basically, in short, like this. There was a terrible plague amongst the Jewish people. Dovid Hamelech finds out that the reason there is this plague is because Shaul mistreated the Givonim. And he needs to go. The Shaul had already passed away. Dovid Hamelech goes to the Givonim and he says, forgive us, because our understanding is that until you forgive us, the plague is going to continue by us. So they said, no, we want to have Nakama. We want to have Nakama. Shaul hurt us so bad, we want to kill 7 of his children. You hand over 7 of his progeny to us, then we'll forgive. Okay, Dovid Hamelech handed off 7 of the children, and Taka, the plague stopped. So let's read what the Gemara in Yevamah says about this account. The Gemara in Yevamah says, Vayikach Hamelech, Dovid Hamelech took Armoini and Mipi Boishas. Okay, these 2 individuals. These were children of Shaul through one of his Pilegesh wife. And then he took Chameshes Bnei Michal Bas Shaul. Shaul had a daughter, Michal. 5 sons, so grandsons of Shaul. So 2 sons, 5 grandsons, and he handed them over to the Givonim. Now there were other children and grandchildren to choose from. So the Gemara asks, Maishnahani, what happens these 7 he took? And for the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna said, He'evirum lifnei Orden. He allowed them to pass by the Aron. These are the weeks in the Parsha and the Torah now. We're learning about the Mishkan and we're learning about the Aron, including in Vayakel, where the Aron is mentioned again. And here we're learning about an extraordinary use, a very unusual use of the Aron. He had them walk past the Aron. And basically, Kol Sha'aron Kolta Lemisa. Anyone who the Aron grabbed, which I assume just means they weren't able to walk anymore. For a few seconds, they tried moving, they weren't able to walk, so then it meant, okay, they need to be handed over. It was a divine sign to be handed over. Kol she'ein aron koltai, any person who the aron didn't grab, was l'chaim. So you have this question of how David chose. He chose in this way, he put it in God's hands, and it was in this miraculous fashion. Correct the Gemara, it sounds really nice. There's just one problem. The problem is, Masiv Rav Chana Bar Katina, there's another pasuk right there in the same area in Sefer Shmuel where it says, Vayachmel Hamelech al mipi boishes ben Yehoinas ben Shaul. That Dovid Hamelech had Rachmanis on Mipi Boishes. This is not the same Mipi Boishes who was handed over. That was Mipi Boishes the son. This is Mipi Boishes the Einikol, the son of Yonasan. He loved Yonasan so much, he didn't give over Yonasan's son. So why are you telling me it was the Arin? Here you see that it was his own choice. And for the Gemara, no. All of them went past the Arin. But he did something special for this Mipi Boishes ben Yonasan. What did he do? He davened for him that the Arin should inchap him. Okay, good. That's the Gemara. Now, what about the first Mipi Boishes? Well, the first Mipi Boishes, the son, it turns out the Gemara in Brachas establishes that he was a teacher of Dovid Hamelech. Frek Tosfos, if he's a teacher, wouldn't it make sense that he would daven for him too? And for Tosfos, v'yesh leimar t'shema bikesh v'lenana. Maybe Taka, you have to say it makes so much sense that he davened for him. Tosfos can't imagine that he wouldn't have davened for his teacher. But at the end of the day, he was handed over. So 2 + 2 = 4. It must be he davened for him. It must be he wasn't answered. Shema bikesh v'lenana. So here you see, there's another instance in where, although it's not clear in Chazal, Tosfos felt pretty comfortable saying that the math leads him to a place to say that Dovid Hamelech asked and his request wasn't granted. Okay, so then you get into a whole pilpul and to say, so could you say it, could you not say it? At the end of the day, I think everyone agrees that where authoritative sources say that Dovid Hamelech asked for something and it wasn't granted, so of course that's the case. Okay, if the Savarana wanted to interpret the Gemara and Baba Basra, okay, fine. He didn't need to, because at the end of the day, you can't reinterpret every single Gemara. And there's nothing wrong with saying that certain things he asked and they weren't granted. There's nothing wrong with that. You see, by Moshe Rabbeinu, certain things were asked and weren't granted. The shaila here, the controversy here is that the Medrash says that he asked and doesn't say that he wasn't granted. Doesn't hint that it wasn't granted, just leaves it alone. So do we have a right to introduce this doubt into that case? That's the chiddush of the Nefesh HaChaim. And the biggest support for this is the fact that you won't find anyone pretty much before the Nefesh HaChaim to say that this request wasn't answered. And in fact, anyone who discussed this Medrash assumed that it was. So for example, there's Shalah. The Shalah talks about the value of saying Tehilim. This is Shalom Mesechas Yuma. He writes, there's nothing greater than Tehilim. We say it on the night of Yom Kippur. It has everything. You have tshuva in there, and you have mechila and slicha in there, and you have tefillah in there, and it also counts as Torah. Why? Because Dovid Hamelech asked that the schar, the people who read Tehilim, should be the same schar as those who read Oimek HaTorah, Negoim Ve'olos, just like they're reading the deepest parts of Torah. So in other words, the Shalah looked at this medrash and took it literally because there's no reason to say otherwise, and that's pretty much the same for all the other ones. So for looking for chazals that bring out that David wasn't answered, that doesn't really change anything because that's not really what the controversy is. The controversy is in an area where Chazal didn't imply that he wasn't answered, and that's really the chiddush of the Nefesh HaChaim. And that's why there was this controversy about it, and that's why it was considered a scandal, and that's why it bothered the Savarana. Of course, it had implications beyond Dovid Hamelech, because as I said before, it does affect how you look at a tzaddik, even one living in the 1800s as well. Now, what's interesting is that the Rebbe spoke about this medrash on numerous occasions, and after going through this sugya and looking at these sichos, all of a sudden something interesting popped out. And that is, I'm quoting from Sichos where there's a tape. So in other words, this is verbatim. The Rebbe is speaking about this, and here, look what the Rebbe writes. This is Yutas Kislev Chavdalad, what the Rebbe said. David hat gebeten, v'nismale b'kashase as hamiras tilim zol zayin nechshav k'negoyim v'ohalos. Okay, you're just listening to that. You don't realize the Rebbe is adding words. David asked, and nismale b'kashase. Okay, that's one example. Then go to Gimel Sivan Tavshan Lamed Zayin. Dovid Hamelech hat gebeten bei Meibishten und hat ausgeführt and accomplished it. As b'shas ha'id ve'zogen Tehilim wird das ein chashav k'negoyim ve'ohalos. Yutas Kislev Tavshan Chav Ches. David hat gebeten bei der Eibishten. As b'shas me ve'zogen die Shirres v'sishpache soll das sein k'negoyim ve'ohalos und wie es ist mashma dortin is ein bakasha and esmale geworden. So 3 separate times the Rebbe is quoting this medrash and going out of his way to say, and by the way, it happened. To me, it sounds like, I can't definitively prove this, but it almost sounds like the Rebbe is aware of this Nefesh HaChaim, and the Rebbe is subtly rejecting this Nefesh HaChaim, and therefore going out of his way to say that he asked, and there's no reason to assume that it wasn't accepted. In fact, the Rebbe goes on to say, is mashma dartin, his bakasha wasn't a smala. Why? So you could say on one level, it's because there is no. If not, it would say no. The Medrash would tell you that. Isn't that valid, important information? Imagine if you're the mechaber of this Medrash, you're writing this down. And you have the information that God rejected it, but you just include his request and that. So on the face of it, it just smells wrong. Something's wrong about it. So that's one reason why it sounds in the smala bakashase. There's another reason. Remember the earlier words. He asked, it should be ledoiros, it should be yuchkak ledoiros. That happened. So in other words, if all the other things happened, so why should you assume that this didn't happen? Therefore, the Rebbe is saying it's mashma that this happened, and so therefore it is a thing. Now, does this mean? I don't think this means that I don't think anyone ever advocated. So therefore, put away the Gemaras, put away the Tosfos, and just say Tehilim all day. That approach is also not. I think the difference would end up being something more along the lines we saw before. A Talmud Chacham, should they say Tehilim every day? Or a little every day? Should they say Tehilim Shabbos and Varach? Should they say Tehilim Yom Kippur by night? Should they say Tehilim Rosh Hashanah? Or do you say, no, it's not for you? That's, I think, where you would end up having the difference between these two approaches. But I think even the people who are the anti-Tehilimers, I think they would say, for the masses, 100%, and it's a good thing, and it's a wonderful thing. And the pro-Tehilimers will say, yeah, but that's only for a small portion of the day. The rest of the day, you need to learn Torah and Negoim Kipshuta and Alois Kipshuta, whatever. So it's not like there's it's not like you can end up having two different religions that results from this, but it ends up being these small difference that L'chaira would result from this. Yeah, so the Frierdiker Rebbe started a campaign for Tehilim already in Russia in the 1920s. And the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote many letters about the value of saying Tehilim and made takanos about saying Tehilim, and it was very, very clear that takana should apply to everyone, even the greatest alumnim. In fact, we have in the Shimis the Rebbe wrote for himself a speech that he was going to present in front of the Agudas Harabanim in America here in the 1940s. I don't know if that speech ever materialized or not. I don't have information. It's just printed in the Rishimis, his notes for the speech. And basically, the thrust of the speech is the Frierdiker Rebbe made takanos about Tehilim. And some people think Tehilim is only for people who can't learn, but this is not true. And the Rebbe quotes the Shalah, and then it cuts off. So yeah, this is this is obviously a very important thing. But by the way, this Shabbos is Shabbos Mevarchim. Don't forget that. Okay. Now let's conclude with the following. There's a Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, a very, very geschmacka Maimer of the Alter Rebbe that's on this subject, and this Maimer Chazal, about Dovid Hamelech saying that it should be Negoim V'Olos. He's addressing the question, why Dafka Negoim V'Olos? So we already answered that question, because we're taking in Chazal, that is the symbol of the deepest sugyas, hardest sugyas, which means you get the most char. Good, that's the answer al pi nigla. You could also find other very, very difficult sugyas, some shvere sugyas and Baba Basra I could have mentioned. So why is it Negoim and all this? So the Alter Rebbe is going to give a very interesting answer in Avodah. Let's have a look at the Maim. The Tamiyah, the Shaila, when you read the Medrash, is an obvious question that arises. Lama lo yeh chashuv Tehilim shu divrei Kabbalah kenegoim va'aloi sharei beruach hakodesh amram. Why would anyone think that Tehilim shouldn't count as the same as Negoim and Alois? After all, it's divrei Kabbalah, meaning it's part of Tanakh. Okay, we interpreted that Dovid Hamelech's request was that it should make it into Tanakh. The Alter Rebbe is presenting it this way. It's part of Divrei Kabbalah, it's part of Tanakh, it was said in Ruach HaKodesh, so what are you asking? Of course it's part of Torah. This is how the Alter Rebbe asks the question. So what was David asking? It wasn't asking that it should count as Torah. That was obvious. He's asking for something else. What's he saying? Because of the problem that we mentioned above. What's that? Lefish, a cold varov. What's all of Tehilim? Chukas v'chemdas lavava yal Hashem. Words of God, of Dovid Hamelech, thirsting for God. Shvachos us miras l'Hashem, and praising the Eibishter. Uvakasha is sheyisayu, and requesting that God help him la'avda b'chol leiv, that he should be able to worship the Eibishter. Here's an example of some of these requests. Kala she'edi ulevavi, my flesh and my heart is expiring for you. Elecha Hashem nafshi yesa, I raise my soul toward you. Ma hafti sedasecha, how much I love your Torah. Okay. Now, let's be honest for a second. I know many people recite Tehillim, they don't think about the words. But if you do think about the words, you could have a little bit of a crisis. What's the crisis? I don't feel that way. A person could say, Ma talas b'amirasam, why recite this? Who amongst the people could actually really feel Who amongst the people could actually feel You really want that? See, why are you saying it? Therefore, Dovid Hamelech says, he's asking that it should be similar to Negoim and Olis. Why? Because by Negoim, who needs to know the dinim? What's saras? The average Jew doesn't need to know. Why? Because he brings it to the Kohen. The Kohen says if it's saras. And yet, all Jews are learning it, even though it's irrelevant to them. There's no real gain for a non-kohen to understand, to learn it, and to know it. And yet, what's the reality? In other words, it's not only about if it's relevant to me, I learn it. Even if it's irrelevant to you, I still learn it. For Alois, he doesn't really fear Ois here, but there's another mimer where he says a similar idea. He seems to say, Alois, it's okay. It's also mostly negeh for kohenim, because they're the ones who have to be more. Now the truth is, it's negeh for a Yisrael. If he wants to go into the Beis Hamikdash, Dinei Tum and Tara is relevant for him, but we'd say it's more relevant for kohenim. And so therefore, because it's more relevant for kohenim, also we could say Alois is irrelevant. So now we're basically using Negoim and Alois not as complex. What we're doing is we're saying it's irrelevant to the average Jew. And yet we learn it. And yet we receive schar. Oh, so Dovid Hamelech turned to the Eibusher and said, may it be that for the Jew who tzam alacha nafshi is irrelevant, for the Jew who the pasuk is irrelevant, yet they should also get the schar, even though it's not meaningful for them, even though they don't mean it. What's the schar going to be? So too, when they read David's passionate words, there's going to be schar. Look what Alter Rebbe says here. And what's the schar going to be? Those who habitually say Tehilim, they're going to get it. They're going to get the tzam alacha nafshi moment. They're going to have an elecha Hashem nafshi asa moment. They're going to have a ma'afti seresecha moment. Af davar echad midvarav dailem. At least one. At least one will be enough. So Alter Rebbe here is saying that's what Dovid Hamelech was asking. When you're saying passages that are irrelevant to you, Negoim and Olos are irrelevant to you, and yet you get schar for that. So get schar for this. And what is the schar going to be? That is taka going to become meaningful. You're taka going to hold by it one day. V'zeu kabbalah schar v'dal. What a very powerful, a very empowering line from the Alter Rebbe. There's another teaching from the Alter Rebbe where he says that even if you're not holding by it, but if you fake it, then it will eventually happen to you. So that may ula yesh l'tzaref that particular thing here. But anyway, so what did we see here? We saw that there's one little maisa with the Savaroner. We're able to see that one story really, some of the issues, the burning issues in the Jewish community in the mid 19th century, all tore us at the seams of this particular story. Whether it's the issue of Torah and Torah Lishma, whether it's the issue of learning Sifrei Yira, whether it's the issue of reciting Tehilim, and whether it's the issue of the role of a tzaddik and the chances that a tzaddik's bakasha are going to be nismala. So let us all hope that our bakashas, v'amech kulam tzaddikim, that our bakashas are going to be nismala, l'toiva, v'levrach.